Hey everyone, Robin from Backscatter here, and today we're taking a look at part 5 of our best settings for the Olympus TG-5 series. In part 5, we'll cover the advanced settings. We'll be going a little bit deeper into the menus and settings to cover all of the tools and techniques that you need to take your TG-5 shooting to the next level. Now these aren't really meant for your first couple of dives with this camera. Rather, these are the things that you need to know to put yourself on the path to becoming master of the TG-5. These don't quite fit into the on the boat and in the water categories like our other settings do, so we're just gonna run through everything here from the coolest to the more mundane, but trust me, these are all key things that you need to know as you spend more time shooting your TG-5. So let's start off with one of our favorite features and one of the most useful, the custom modes. These are super handy because they allow you to store your best settings to 2 of the positions on the mode dial with the C1 and C2 modes. This is most often used for quick swaps between wide angle and macro on the same dive for maximum versatility, but the real applications here are basically unlimited. You can program just about anything based on your dive and what you expect to be shooting. Start by getting your best settings all dialed in. For instance, here I have microscope mode with our best settings applied, and I'll just assign that to C1. Then we'll get to aperture priority, set that for wide angle, and save that to C2. Now we're just one stop on the mode dial from switching shooting styles, and everything except the zoom level is set for each shooting style. One aspect of this that we really like is that if you change anything while you're in your custom mode, it resets if you just change modes and then change back, or if you power cycle the camera. Now this means you can adjust exposure and other settings on the fly as your scene or shooting environment changes, but if you want to immediately just go back to your pre-assigned settings, just change modes and change back with one click. In our opinion, this is where the TG-5 starts feeling really cool and where you make the jump from shooting just a camera to shooting your camera. Next, let's talk about focus lock. As we mentioned in part 4, when shooting video in autofocus, the camera can do these little focus hunts in the middle of your clips. They can range from a mild annoyance up to being so bad that they just completely kill the clip. This is because the autofocus mode is continuous, so the camera is constantly trying to update that focus based on the subject and whether it's changing distance or if there's elements that come in front of the lens or the focus area. And we can use the focus lock feature to fix the focus on one distance and completely override that continuous autofocus, therefore eliminating the focus hunting altogether. Activate focus lock by holding a half press of the shutter and then hitting the OK button. Your focal distance is now locked to whatever you acquired focus on. The camera won't attempt to update focus at all, so there won't be any focus hunting, but this also means that now you're responsible for not changing your shooting distance and the focus on the subject too drastically. In wide angle, especially for close focus wide angle, you really don't want to move more than about 6 inches or so closer or farther to your subject, otherwise you can start to drift in and out of focus. When shooting macro, you've got almost no room for changing distance because our depth of field is so much smaller. But you should really be using a tripod for macro video and working with a relatively stationary subject, so changing distance isn't something that comes into play as much as it does with wide angle. If you need to update the focus, you can just hit the OK button, canceling the focus lock, and then reacquire focus lock again, or we can manually change the distance using the up and down controls, though we need to activate focus peaking first in order to really take advantage of this. Focus peaking outlines the sharpest part of the image with a contrasting color, allowing you to see where the focus is set even if you can't determine it with just your eyes and the image itself. We can activate this in the menus, but after turning it on, make sure to also set the color to red, which is the easiest to see because of its high contrast in most underwater shooting situations. Now once we have a focus lock obtained, we can use the up and down controls and adjust our focus closer or farther while using the focus peaking to see where we're at. You can even use the top dial on the camera to adjust the focus in either direction in much smaller increments. This is awesome for macro when you really want to get that eyeball tack sharp. This is our preferred focus technique for underwater video because it means you'll never have to deal with a focus hunt again. This is also cool because it's all the functionality of the TG-5's manual focus feature, but it's actually way easier to use and it utilizes the great autofocus performance, rendering the manual focus options mostly obsolete. Now while we're talking about focus here, let's cover how to set the autofocus area. Bring it up in the menus and you'll see there are 3 options: auto, single, and tracking. We prefer single because you can control where the focus is being set, giving you more control over your image. Auto may not always default to exactly where you want it, and tracking doesn't always work that well underwater, depending on the conditions and the types of subjects. With single point, you aren't just locked into the center of the frame either. You can adjust where the focus point is set within the frame, which is a handy tool when composing your shot and making sure that focus is set just where you want it. Now, if something is happening fast and you don't have time to set that focus point right where you want it for composition, just leave it in the center of the frame, lock focus by aiming at what you want to focus on, then compose and shoot from there. Just make sure not to change the distance to the subject as you're recomposing too significantly. The next feature we'll cover is the Pro Capture mode, which doesn't hold a lot of functionality for us underwater, but it is a cool feature that you should be aware of. Pro Capture mode is actually a frame rate setting, not a true mode all its own. You can activate it in both microscope and aperture priority modes. It's basically a pre-roll mode where the camera buffers images to the internal memory upon a half press and a hold of the shutter button. Once you fully depress the shutter button, it's going to write those previously buffered images to the memory card along with the image that you captured with the full press of the shutter. This means it's capturing those images from before you hit the shutter, allowing you to still capture the action even if you're a little bit slow on the draw. Now, one huge caveat here is that you cannot retroactively fire a strobe or the camera's flash, so this feature really isn't applicable when shooting with strobes. It's only going to work with either ambient light only shooting, or when shooting photos with a video light because of the constant source of light. This is a pretty cool ability in our opinion, and we just wish there were more ways we could use it underwater. If you have a cool shot or a use for Pro Capture mode that you found, let us know in the comments. Now let's move on to some flash settings, specifically why we'll be using manual flash power instead of TTL. TTL is basically auto flash mode and has been covered in the other videos in this series. Now that we're a little more advanced, we'll switch to manual for some serious benefits to our shooting. The main reason to shoot with a manual flash power is speed, because the lower the flash output, the faster it can recycle to fire again, meaning more shots in less time, and that's the key to success in nature photography and getting that one perfect shot. So go ahead and bring up the flash options in the quick menu and set that flash power to manual 1/64th. That's the lowest power setting available, and thus it's the fastest shooting speed possible. And even though this is the lowest power, it's plenty bright enough to activate our strobes via the fiber optic cable. This low power also saves us some battery life, since it does take some battery juice to make that flash go off. You can set and forget that flash power, then all you need to manage lighting-wise underwater is your strobe position and power, which we've covered extensively in the other videos in this series. From there, just take some test shots, review them on screen, make the adjustments you need to your position and power, brightening or darkening the strobe output as needed, and walk it in from there. Remember, the brighter your strobes, the farther that light will travel, so always be thinking about strobe power relative to the distance of the subject or the scene that you're trying to light. Now, the TG-5 also has some tools that we can use to really get our exposure perfectly dialed in and correct in camera. These are things like the highlight and shadow warnings and the histogram. You can turn these tools on here in the menus. Highlight and shadow warnings identify the overexposed or underexposed parts of your image and call them out by blinking during the image review on screen. Use this to avoid having blown out areas that lack detail or areas that are completely shadowed and too dark to reveal detail. The histogram is an on-screen graph that we can use to judge the overall exposure of our image. The left side of this graph is your shadows and the right side is the highlights where most of the color tones are found. If the graph is clipping to either side, this means you have elements that are overexposed in your image if it's clipping to the right, or underexposed if it's clipping to the left. If you're clipping on the histogram, then you're losing detail somewhere in that image. A good technique for determining the proper exposure is to get the histogram to where it's just starting to clip on the right side, then back off a stop or two, keeping it nicely exposed towards the right side of the graph without clipping. Now there's even an RGB histogram for checking color, which we use a lot when checking out the blue water background of wide-angle shots. You want to keep that blue clustered around the center of the graph because being slightly underexposed here shifts more towards those deeper blue tones and away from the less desirable, brighter cyan tones. Now the biggest thing to remember when shooting and using histograms is to consider the context of what the graph is telling you. For example, shooting up into a sunball is always going to have completely overexposed elements within it. That's just how that style of shot works. It's just like how a macro shot is probably going to have a dark background that can be completely shadowed. That's what we're after. Always balance what your exposure tools are telling you against the style of the shot that you're trying to achieve. Next, we'll cover file format and why we shoot in RAW instead of JPEG. RAW is an uncompressed file format, and therefore it allows for non-destructive editing. You have way more latitude to make decisions about exposure and color with a RAW image than you do with a JPEG, because a JPEG is compressed and it has the exposure and color data baked right into the image itself. Trying to edit a JPEG photo is going to result in it falling apart right before your eyes. Now, the biggest impact that shooting in RAW has on us underwater photographers is the ability to change the white balance in post. With a program like Adobe Lightroom, you can update the white balance with one click and recover some outstanding color that would otherwise be lost in a JPEG. Shooting in RAW also helps eliminate banding in those blue tones of background wide-angle shots with open water. You can make much smoother blue gradations when developing a RAW image than you can working with a JPEG. Now, the thing is, you have to use special software to develop a RAW image. There's a lot of options out there, and Olympus even gives you their proprietary software free with the camera purchase. We recommend using Adobe Lightroom, which is really the best program for working with RAW files and organizing your entire photo catalog. Since we're going to be shooting in RAW, let's also get the most color that we can out of that image by setting the color space in our camera. We'll go into the menus and set the color space from sRGB to Adobe RGB. Adobe RGB has a much wider color gamut, and it's the best color space to shoot in to have the most latitude in editing. Adobe RGB is also better for making prints from your images, while sRGB is better for displaying on screens and monitors. The best practice here is to shoot everything in Adobe RGB, then you can always export from Lightroom in either Adobe or sRGB, depending on whether you're heading to the print shop or you're just posting to Facebook or Instagram. Next up is the GPS feature and the log lever. And we call this the battery drain switch, since it has zero application for us underwater. The GPS can't work underwater in the housing at dive depths. The one thing we have found where this is useful is for marking the location of a dive site topside. If you're out on open water or you're somewhere remote and you want to log the coordinates, you can turn this feature on, take a shot, and then just turn it back off. You can even do this from within the housing, since the log lever does have an external control. Otherwise, we're just going to keep that log lever off, and we're going to make sure to set the GPS location recording to off and set GPS priority to battery power to ensure that nothing in this department is slowly draining battery power while we're underwater. Next, we'll go into the menu and we'll find the sleep settings. This controls the amount of idle time before the screen goes dark and the camera will need to be woken up with a button press. Any button press will wake up the camera. We recommend either setting this to 5 minutes or just to off. If you do set it to off, just don't forget to turn your camera off after your dive, otherwise you could be draining battery power during your surface interval. And finally, let's set our image review time. This is called Rec View in the menus. The default setting is only half a second, and I don't know about you, but that's not really enough time for me to review my image and make critical decisions about exposure, composition, and lighting. We recommend setting this instead to 2 seconds, which is at least enough time to make quick evaluations or determine if you actually need to do a more critical review, in which case just hit the review button and take your time. You can also zoom in when reviewing for a tight look to check your focus and critical details. Well folks, that's about it. I know some of these things aren't as cool or as exciting as some of the other tips and techniques we've covered, but with this knowledge, your TG-5 training is basically complete. Now just get out there and start putting these things to the test underwater. And when you have any questions, just reach out to us here at Backscatter, where we dive, shoot, and service everything we sell. I'm Robin from Backscatter signing off, and stay tuned for the next video where we'll cover the best accessories for the TG-5.